right. Thank you so much, Robin, and to everybody at NACW for inviting me to back to NACW this year. I've had a chance to speak a couple of times, and it's weird being here in this role, you know, a former CARB person really kind of waving the flag for California and CARB, but not being on the inside, which means that I don't have to dodge questions about what's really happening in the rulemaking because I don't know. So it makes it a little more freeing, a little easier. And it gives me an opportunity to just talk about things that I'm feeling really passionate about as we move forward in this work. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the state of play in California generally, and talk about California's critical work on GHG and climate risk disclosure. So first, you know, I'm going to sort of reiterate a little bit of context that I think you all know, but sometimes it's really important to take a moment to celebrate our success and our progress. You know, California has led the way on climate with a portfolio approach to decarbonization that has reduced greenhouse gas emissions, even as our economy has grown and has become the fourth largest economy in the world. And that portfolio approach has reaped dramatic benefits. From our core air quality strategies, starting from the early days of CARB, to the success of the Cap and Trade, now Cap and Invest program, including groundbreaking verifiable carbon removal protocols that help keep carbon progress affordable, the low carbon fuel standard that has displaced more than 50% of fossil diesel with renewable fuel, to the renewables portfolio standard, to SB 100, which requires utilities to have 100% of their retail sales be renewable, to our robust planning processes that move utilities toward reducing their greenhouse gas emissions overall, toward the target set by CARB, and now a regional electricity market to ensure the most cost-effective sharing of resources across jurisdictions in the West. And yes, the suite of regulatory action CARB has taken to move light, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles to zero emissions by mid-century, and we are fighting very hard in court to keep those rules in place. But in this moment in history, we are really challenged. Instead of reducing our dependence on fossil fuels and increasing the choice that customers have, at the federal level, we are finding ourselves faced with huge price shocks due to tariffs. We are facing a war, like who thought this would happen? A disruption, worldwide disruption to our energy supply, massive price increases, and policies that have gone backwards. Back in the 1970s, when we had to deal with these kind of shocks, there were policy initiatives that were groundbreaking and created the foundation that we have built upon over these last years. Fuel economy standards, appliance standards, kicking off the solar energy industry. But I don't think we're going to see that at the federal level. We are not going to see the kind of policy innovation that this country has done in the past. And so it's really up to California and our partner states like Washington, like Illinois, like New York, to really carry this mantle forward and to continue this leadership. And we're absolutely not giving up. The legislature in California reauthorized the Cap and Invest program. The dedicated team at CARB is hard at work on the regulation implementing that reauthorization. CARB kept the really critical low carbon fuel standard in place and strengthened it, and is continuing to fulfill its role as a leader in the climate space by implementing North America's first GHG disclosure requirements. So I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the importance of that work and how it relates to what everyone in this room is working on. SB 253, the Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, is California's landmark law requiring large companies to publicly disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions. And SB 261 requires large companies doing business in California to publicly disclose their climate-related financial risks and making those disclosures in alignment with existing voluntary disclosure frameworks. And the goal of this legislation is to give investors, to give consumers, to give policymakers visibility into how companies are identifying and managing climate risk, given the increasing awareness that climate risk is financial risk. These laws are designed to work in tandem, with SB 253 providing that emissions data and 261 providing the risk context around those emissions. There has been significant litigation over both of these laws. SB 261 is currently enjoined. SB 253 has not been enjoined, but is still in court. The regulatory process is underway. And the first disclosure deadline is this coming August. The first fees are required to be paid by companies in September. So CARB is moving forward and implementing SB 253 and making sure that companies understand that they need to report their scope 1 and scope 2 GHG emissions by August of this year. CARB has recognized that the regulatory requirements aren't fully baked and determined, so it has stated that companies can use their good faith efforts to comply. And CARB is hard at work on the next iteration of that rulemaking so that those more detailed requirements will be in place in time for disclosure in 2027, when scope 3 emissions will start, when limited assurance requirements will start. And so that process is underway. You know, CARB has had several workshops, one just a couple weeks ago, to really understand and iterate around the complex issues about disclosure. So I encourage all of you to think about participating in that. And it's important to note that CARB is not starting from scratch as they're developing these regulatory requirements. Both of the disclosure laws are building on years of voluntary reporting, widely used frameworks, and real-world experiences of companies and data providers. Voluntary reporting really started building and testing and understanding what this kind of disclosure would look like. Numerous international reporting structures have been underway and helped us understand what are the unique challenges that we have to deal with when building requirements and trying to create some level of consistency. And so that voluntary work has reaped huge benefits, and the mandatory reporting that CARB is implementing now is supporting that voluntary ecosystem. Mandatory reporting creates consistency, clarifies the standard, and strengthens that voluntary disclosure interactions that continue to happen kind of at the edges of new disclosure requirements. So this is familiar, right? Voluntary frameworks function as R&D labs for compliance. They stress test methodologies, they build practitioner capacity, and they surface what works before the regulation arrives. And then compliance regimes, in turn, give voluntary frameworks credibility, signals, and scale that they are not necessarily achieving on their own in the early days. So companies that go beyond what is currently the floor of compliance for the GHG disclosures, by beginning their 261 climate risk disclosure early, just go ahead, voluntarily get started doing it, that start doing the scope 3 analysis and disclosure early, to understand what their scope 3 issues are and their supply chain decarbonization strategies are. Those companies will define what that corporate leadership looks like in the disclosure world. And that leadership can yield significant benefits for those companies. as they more fully understand their emissions profiles and how they can improve them. At a recent conference, I heard a statistic that only 14% of companies that have net zero pledges have a fully formed strategy to get there. And that illustrates that this accounting and disclosure process is not just an exercise. It helps challenge assumptions about where emissions are. It daylights opportunities for GHG reductions. And CARB's draft disclosure proposal, the template that they have proposed for disclosure that they will be iterating on through the course of this process, builds on the practice of other GHG disclosure protocols and ensures that companies have an opportunity to disclose not only their emissions, but strategies that they are using to reduce and offset those emissions, including renewable energy credits, including cleaner fuels, and including decarbonization investments that they are making that aren't part of the 1, 2, and 3 buckets, but are areas where they are reducing and offsetting their emissions. And it gives companies the opportunity to articulate that story and share it with their investors, with their customers, with their employees, so that they can share the good work that they're doing. It is beyond frustrating to be in a place where we are watching climate action rollbacks leave us more vulnerable. We're more vulnerable to that international fossil fuel pricing framework that no matter what you do in an individual jurisdiction, this global market is determining your price for fuels. And we are doing this in a policy situation where the alternatives to that captivity are being stripped away and are losing support at the national level. We see these rollbacks leaving us an auto industry that is getting lapped by the rest of the world. We see these policy decisions causing what would be a huge opportunity to grow an offshore wind industry being brutally attacked. The idea that our federal government would incentivize a company to abandon an offshore wind project is, again, beyond frustrating. But the robust disclosure of actual emissions, actual risk, as well as disclosure of the investments that will help reduce those risks and prevent those risks, can help companies focus on the long term. The long term, reducing emissions, reducing costs, and reducing vulnerabilities. If you look at climate markets, the most effective climate action arrived on the foundation of voluntary action that proves the concept. The practitioners that are doing this work are not peripheral to the regulatory story, they're the beginning of that regulatory story. And this next chapter on disclosure will be written in the same way. Companies and organizations that are willing to move quickly, robustly, before they are required to, and who can show regulators what is possible, will, as I said before, they will be the leaders. Programs with robust accounting and transparency that are voluntary, that compliance entities can use to advance their own efforts to show environmental stewardship will reap benefits. California has always taken innovation from the private sector and provided paths to integrate that innovation into regulatory programs, and in the disclosure regulatory work that's happening in real time. So I want to encourage those of you who are interested in this work to engage in the CARB rulemaking, to share your thoughts. Those comments, that input gets read, it gets paid attention to, and it informs the final result. So please participate in that process. Please support the continued growth of robust climate disclosure. And I really am so happy to be here in a room with people who want to see this work move forward. And so thank you all for listening, and thank you for continuing to do this work every single day.